so we're going to look at this. We're going to look at this diagram, then we're going to go back. So, start with an abstract philosophical concept. I want to be a good person. Well, you might debate forever about what the good means, right? It's the sort of philosophical conundrum that you can fall into because you can think in abstractions. And then you might think of it as a property of the world, and it's something that's subject to eternal debate, which is exactly what's happened in the history of mankind. But there's another way of looking at it that's actually probably more accurate, and I would say also more useful. And this is the way. It's like, so you're going to try to be a good person. Well, the Piagetian view would be being a good person. It's not a state of mind. What it is an abstraction that represents, well, first, other associated abstractions, because we could say, well, being a good person is a multidimensional problem, right? You can't just be good and then it's done. It's like being a good person might mean being good at, well, what? Well, good at being a friend, good at being a lover, good at being a parent, good at being a child, good at being an employee. You could say, well, good is what's the same across all those things, and Piaget would call that a scheme, just so you know, because a scheme is what's the same across multiple different things. So, and the scheme is the basis of abstraction for Piaget. So good person is the sum total, or the commonalities between being a good teacher, student, employee, etc. Okay? So then we'll say, okay, so now we can move the problem of analysis one level down, and we can say, okay, well, what does it mean to be a good parent? And then you'd say, well, maybe you have to have a good job, because, otherwise you and your child starve, but we'll forget about that one for a moment. And then you might say, well, you have to do a good job of taking care of your family. Okay, so you notice we're zeroing in on an element of the good here. And it's still an abstraction. Care for your family, that's an abstraction. So then you might say, well, one of the things you would do if you cared for your family is play with the baby, and another might be complete a meal. So we'll take the play with the baby example, and then there's 3 things you can do with your baby. You can peek at it, they like that. That's object permanence, eh? There's nothing more thrilling to a baby than discovering that you're still there when you disappear. Like a baby, you can amuse a baby for hours with that discovery, because it's by no means self-evident to the baby. That's a Piagetian notion. They lack object permanence. So as far as they're concerned, it's a hell of a shock when you disappear, because they were just appreciating you being there, and then they're just as shocked when you reappear. And it's so interesting to watch them, because when a baby gets startled, like when you get startled, you might go like that. If you're really startled, a baby, it's like its whole body is startled, right? It makes a weird face, and it moves its arms and its legs, and then it takes it like 5 seconds to recover. They really have a startle reflex. So, and they'll often laugh. I'm sure you've seen the laughing babies on YouTube, because of course there's like 2 billion views of laughing babies, which is a good thing. It shows that we like babies. I think there's one that's very famous where a baby is reacting to his mother either sneezing or coughing. You know the one? God, it's absolutely hilarious. This baby just has a fit. And what's basically happening is its mother coughs, I think it's coughs or maybe sneezes.
Blows her nose.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, she blows her nose. So she makes this weird elephant-like noise. And the baby is like shocked that mother could do this. And then it gets surprised at its own startle, and that makes it laugh. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon from a Piagetian perspective, because one of the things that Piaget noticed that children did, because they could imitate, was imitate themselves. That's how they got to know who they were. So, for example, if a child would accidentally knock that off when they're eating, well, that's a hell of a thing to discover. If you move your arm just a little bit, that'll fall off. That's cool. So then maybe you can do that 60, 70 times while you're supposed to be eating. And the other thing that's really cool about doing that is that mom will immediately rush over and pick that up and put it back. And this is an excellent game. You can entertain yourself with that for like a month. And basically what you're discovering is the relationship between your movements and gravity, right? It's like, this is a major league discovery. It's no wonder you're obsessed with it. So anyways, the point with regards to imitation is maybe the baby does this accidentally to begin with. That startles them. And then it's put up again, and then they think, well, that was cool. Wonder if we can do that again. And then they're pretty happy about that. And then they'll keep practicing that until they get like expert at doing that. So instead of using like gross body movements to do it, which is how they'd start, they develop finer and finer and finer body movements until they've got the whole knock a light thing off a table down. And it can even be fascinating as an adult. Some of you have probably played table hockey, you know, with a quarter. You know how to do that? Put a quarter on a table. It's not very complicated. You make little goal. Your job is to flick the thing so that it just sits that far over the table end so that the opponent can flip it up. That's like your opportunity to score a goal. My point is, playing with how things move in relationship to friction and gravity is so engrossing to human beings that you can even make a game out of it if you're, you know, a relatively bored and stupid adult. So, I played that game all the time with my son, by the way, so I put myself in that category as well. Now, what the child is doing is, it'll accidentally, in some ways, bumble into something interesting. And then it recognizes that it's interesting in a sense because that's a reflex action on its part. And then once it recognizes that it's had that reflex action, which is kind of, it's pleasurable as long as it's not too intense, it's at least interesting, then they'll try to imitate what they just did. So part of the way you master yourself is by imitating yourself after you've accidentally done something interesting. It's so smart, so that's a Piagetian notion. So anyways, you're playing with the baby, and you can play peek with the baby. That's a good one. You're teaching it that you're still there even though you went away. And you can tickle the baby, which is best done in moderation, because it's not exactly clear that babies enjoy that. They just laugh when you do that so that you like them and don't throw them out the window when they're being annoying. And then you can clean the baby too. Say those are elements of the care of a baby. I know that's not very sophisticated, but you know, those are some of the basics. Now the thing that's different about play with baby and tickle baby is that play with baby is an abstraction, whereas tickle baby is an action, right? And so when you're trying to solve the mind-body problem, this is how you solve it. The mind is those abstractions. The body is the actions that those abstractions ground themselves in. So it's not like the mind is attached to the body. It's the mind is a sequence of hierarchically arranged abstractions, the bottom level of which are not abstractions, they're actions. There's a qualitative transformation at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the highest resolution level of the hierarchy. It's action. Now, you can understand Piaget very, very easily if you understand that the way a baby develops as far as Piaget is concerned is from the bottom up. So the baby starts with, it's lying in its crib. It's a useless thing. It's laying there. It can't even focus its eyes. You know, it's just barely getting going. So it's sort of floating in space, trying to figure out what's going on. You know, and it doesn't even know that it has arms, really. It just sort of detects these things off to the side. It'll often bonk itself in the face with its arms, or scratch itself, because you have to cut babies' nails really short, because otherwise they scratch themselves, because their arms are just, you know, wandering around randomly. And the baby sorts of, from a Piagetian perspective, the baby starts to learn what its body is capable of doing. And some of that it just discovers by accident. Now, there's no doubt some natural neurological progression that's going on. So the baby is learning along the paths that babies can learn. But still, from a Piagetian perspective, the baby is doing quite a bit of exploring to facilitate its neurological development. And more complex animals may be doing that in the womb, you know, trying out their legs and so on, so that they can run as soon as they, you know, as soon as they get up. So it's not even obvious that all that sort of thing is reflexive and automatic in an animal that is more active when it's born. So the baby begins by, basically it sort of develops from the middle outward. So what's the baby got when it first pops into the world? Well, it can't see very well, although it can focus at about 12 inches, which conveniently is about the distance that its head is from its mother's eyes if it's breastfeeding. So that's good for social communication. So the mother can gaze at the baby, and the baby can gaze at the mother, and for some reason they both find that fascinating. So the baby's also very wired up around the mouth. So it can use its mouth quite a lot, and it can use its tongue. Those come pre-wired. So, and this is kind of a Freudian observation. So at the beginning, the baby really is oral, because that's all that works. Like it can smell too, you know. But its voluntary capacity for action is really centered around its mouth. And you'll notice that babies, or toddlers even, love to put things in their mouth. My son, when he was a kid, he used to go in the backyard we did feed him, so wasn't the reason. He'd go in the backyard and pick up acorns and stuff his cheeks with them, just like a chipmunk. And so, you know, then we'd take him up to the bath and we'd have to like dig all the acorns out of his cheeks. And he did that for, oh God, way longer than you'd expect any sane child to do it. So, but the reason that he would put things in his mouth, and you think about this, is there's nothing that's a better exploratory organ than your tongue. I mean, check out one of your teeth. Bloody thing feels like it's about this big to your tongue. As you'll notice if you ever get a tooth removed, it's like the Grand Canyon was just instantiated inside your mouth. And then of course your tongue will work like mad of its own accord to investigate every tiny little crevice in that new hole, because your brain wants to know what's your mouth and what isn't, so that if there's something in your mouth that either should or shouldn't be, A, it can tell it from you, and B, it can tell whether or not it's supposed to be there. Turns out to be very important, right? Because, well, there's tooth decay, that's a problem. But, there's also insects and poison and all sorts of other things that you shouldn't put in your mouth. So don't underestimate the degree to which you can zoom around the world like a, Hoover vacuum cleaner and pick up a god-awful amount of information. And of course, you also feed that way, obviously. And so, you're checking out your mother with your mouth and your tongue in a very meaningful way too. And while you're feeding at the breast, you're establishing the basis of social relationships. Now, this puts a bit of a warp into the Piagetian hypothesis, because Piaget sort of assumed that the baby builds himself from the bottom up, right? But one of the things you have to understand is that the baby is always picking up how to behave and see in a very, very, very social context, even when it's so young that Piaget would regard it as primarily egocentric, because what the hell does a baby know about you? But the mother is teaching the child how to act right from the time it's a little tiny thing. Like, if it's going to breastfeed, it has to do it in a relatively civilized manner. Because if it bites his mother, or her mother, which a baby can do, they can really chomp you a good one if their minds are made up to do that. It's like unpleasant consequences are going to ensue. At minimum, the mother is going to startle and, stop feeding the baby. And, maybe she'll put the baby down, or God only knows. One time when my son was very young, I guess he was about 13 months, he had just learned to walk. And he walked up to my wife, who was wearing shorts, and he bit her right here. And a good chomp, he was just teething, eh? And she reflexed, her leg shot out as a reflex, and he must have flown 6 feet. It's like, that's how you socialize children against sudden bites, So it's even the smallest alterations of their behavior take place within an intensely social context. So even at this level, the society is helping guide and restrict the development of the child's motor activities. Now, children tend to develop, as I said, they develop gross body movements first, so they kind of learn to fling their arms. So maybe you put a mobile in the crib for your baby to look at. By the way, most mobiles, you'll notice, maybe they're fish. So you're a parent, you're standing here, and this is the side of the fish, and this is the bottom of the fish. And that's what the baby is looking at. It's like the baby is looking at lines, because the fish are there for the adults. It's like, that's a stupid mobile. You get the fish turned over so the baby can see the fish, and then you make them out of like black and white, because babies are very good at picking up high contrast, and that's a baby mobile rather than a mother mobile. So you got to decide whether the mobile's for you or for your baby. So anyways, you put the mobile above the baby, and you kind of want to put it within limb length, and then the baby will watch this thing. Who knows, maybe it's annoyed to death by this thing. We don't know. It's like, and then it'll sort of flail about like it does in a not very well controlled manner, and maybe it'll flail an arm or a leg, and now and then it'll get lucky and it'll nail one of those fish, and that'll startle it. And so usually it might cry then, because that might have just, if it's a neurotic baby, it'll cry. It's like, that's too much for today. Take the whole while away. But if it's a kind of a outgoing exploratory baby, then the next thing it's really going to want to do is to figure out how to make that fish move again. And then it'll sit there and practice flailing its leg. It's like it's throwing its leg at the fish. And if it gets lucky, it'll nail it a good one, and then that'll make it laugh. And then, it'll practice doing that over a sequence of, babies are persistent, man. So when my daughter was little, she was about 18 months old, we bought her this little cardboard box that had little cardboard Disney books in it, you know, and she didn't care what the Disney books were. What she was really interested in is getting those 3 books out of the Disney box and then trying to get them back in. Because it turned out that was quite difficult because they fit tightly, so this was a great puzzle for her because, you know, she was still getting the whole coordination thing going. And she'd sit for like 3 hours getting those books in that box, and that was like a toy for a week till she figured it out. And then she was on to bigger and better things. But that's a big deal, right? You can imagine what you're doing neurologically when you're doing that. It's like, first of all, you got to grip that book properly. Second, you got to orient it precisely. Third, as you add the additional books to the box, the shape changes because the books flop over, you know, because they'll flop over diagonally. So the shape changes, so you've got to figure out how to adjust that. And then the book itself will open, and that'll get in the way. So you've got to keep the book closed. And, you know, the tolerances are like 1/18 of an inch. So you want to master that. And, like, some people don't. I had a client once who had a very low fluid intelligence, probably 75, 80. You wouldn't have known it by looking at him. But he couldn't find employment. Surprise, surprise. There's no jobs in our society for people who are at that end of the cognitive distribution. I got him a volunteer job at one point, and his job was to put paper in envelopes. He had to fold it up in 3, because that's how you fold up a piece of paper, and then you have to put it in an envelope. But that actually turns out to be hyper complex. I probably trained him for 28 to 30 hours to do that. And because when you do it next time, or you could do it now, you just think about what you're doing. It's, first of all, merely by observing the piece of paper, you have to figure out how to make the first fold. And it better be damn close to 1/3. Because if it isn't, when you make the second fold, you're going to compound your error, and then you're going to find, to your chagrin, that the piece of paper does not fit in the envelope, because the envelope is exactly the same size as the piece of paper. So if you're out by your estimate, say 1/4 of an inch, in your first fold, you're out by 1/2 inch in your second fold, it's like it's not going in there. Or if you don't fold it completely at 90 degrees, you know, so the edges line up, say you're out by 1/16 of an inch. And then you do that again, so now you're out by 1/8. It won't fit in sideways. So then you have to mangle the envelope to get the paper in there. And then by the time you're done mangling the envelope, not only does it look ugly, but it will not go through an automatic sorting machine. So, and then added to that was the problem that on these pieces of paper, there were often photographs stapled, because he was working for a charity. So then, but the photographs weren't always stapled at exactly the same place on the piece of paper. So then he'd have to look at the piece of paper, and he'd have to figure out where the photograph is, and then he'd have to figure out how to fold the piece of paper so that he didn't bend the photograph so that it would still fit in the envelope. And that just he'd just sweat himself to death trying to solve that problem, because there was time pressure too. So, and then there's an added level of complexity on top of that. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it'll give you some sense of how, you know, simple actions are aggregated into increasingly complex operations. Some of the envelopes were French and some of them were English, because it was Canada. And so you couldn't put a French letter in an English envelope. You know, the French ones had to go in a separate pile. And then there was a huge stack, say, of English letters, and a huge stack of English envelopes, all of which hypothetically had been stacked so that each one corresponded to the other. But now and then, one of them would be out of alignment. So then you had to figure out whether it was the letters that were out of the alignment or the envelopes. Well, that's a high complexity working memory problem, and that just brings them to a standstill. So, anyways, you know, during typical development, you develop those incredibly fine motor skills early, which is part of the reason why it's kind of nice to have your baby, toddler, infant, do something by itself. You know, like sit there with a box till it gets a little bored, and then it'll start to figure out what to do with the box. And that's part of play, and that's part of the development of its embodied conceptual structure. So